A single keystroke erases a ghost, ending a decades-long hunt without a single shot fired or a pair of handcuffs. For only the 7th time in history, the Bureau admits defeat, removing a prime target while he remains completely free. While the world's finest hunters pack their bags, the target celebrates his immunity in a city they cannot touch. The fraud relied on a circular trade loop, where money masked as revenue traveled through binary chains of offshore shell companies. He didn't study violence. He studied the math of power, earning an economics degree to weaponize the global banking system. In the heart of America, he built a monument to deception, a billion-dollar company that existed only on paper. The raid revealed a staggering truth. The assembly lines were silent, and the high-tech equipment was merely a stage prop. They weren't manufacturing anything. They were simply repackaging legitimate products to fool investors into believing the lie. $150 million of retirement savings vanished in a single afternoon as the Magnet Empire collapsed. Every order originated from Budapest, routed through a labyrinth of shell companies to keep the mastermind's hands clean. Investigators realized they weren't chasing a common fraudster, but the shadow boss of a global criminal syndicate. A 45-count indictment was unsealed, charging him with racketeering, conspiracy, and massive financial crimes against the state. He mastered the art of money laundering, washing dirty capital through a bypass system that stumped the best accountants. Your pension, your savings, your future. For Mogilevich, these were just numbers to be manipulated and stolen. The investigation hit a geopolitical wall. He was a Russian citizen in a land that refuses to extradite its own. He is the boss of bosses, a man who moves with impunity through the highest circles of Russian society. The agency's white whale remains in deep waters, forever out of reach of the hooks of American law. Every square foot of the Pennsylvania facility was engineered to deceive, a physical manifestation of a digital lie. The scam was global, exploiting the gaps between jurisdictions to create a financial ghost that couldn't be caught. When the agency finally called, there was no one left to answer, only the echoes of a billion-dollar ghost. He is more than a man. He is a symbol of the limits of power in a world without borders. The market is a theater, and Mogilevich was the director, the lead actor, and the only one who got paid. In Russia, he is protected by a labyrinth of political connections that no law enforcement agency can navigate. The case remains open in theory, but in reality, the file is buried under the weight of geopolitical truth. You cannot win a game when your opponent is playing by a different set of rules in a different world. The hunt is over, but the shadow remains, a constant reminder that some ghosts are simply too powerful to catch. If the world's most powerful agency can be forced to surrender, who is truly in control of our world? To dismantle a ghost, the agency had to decode a financial labyrinth built on lies and circular logic. The YBM Magnex fraud wasn't just a scam. It was a masterclass in exploiting the friction between international borders. Mogilevich understood that while law enforcement stops at the shoreline, digital capital moves at the speed of light. He utilized a technique called circular trading, where the same shipment of magnets moved between shell companies repeatedly. Each rotation of the goods created a paper trail of artificial revenue that inflated the stock price by millions. This mathematical loophole allowed him to manufacture profit out of thin air while maintaining a facade of legitimacy. He didn't just break the law. He rewrote the rules of the global market to favor his shadow empire. The brilliance of his methodology lay in its simplicity, hidden behind layers of complex multinational corporate structures. By the time investigators realized the factory was a stage set, the capital had already vanished into the digital void. Mogilevich's academic background in economics provided the foundation for a criminal enterprise that functioned like a sovereign central bank. He transformed traditional organized crime into a high-frequency financial weapon that the Bureau was completely unprepared to combat effectively. Every transaction was a calculated move in a grand game of chess played against an opponent who didn't exist. The technical methodology was his greatest shield, rendering the agency's traditional investigative tools obsolete and utterly ineffective. Behind the curtain of YBM, A more sinister network of human trafficking and arms dealing flourished in the shadows. He recruited the brightest minds from fallen Soviet institutions to manage the complex flow of illicit and legal funds. This synthesis of military precision and economic theory created a monster that no single nation could ever hope to contain. The hunt for the man became a hunt for a ghost, hiding inside a trillion-dollar global financial system. As the stock ticker climbed, the reality of the deception remained buried under mountains of meticulously forged corporate documents. The technical loophole wasn't just about money. It was about the cold, mechanical removal of human empathy from the equation. He operated from Budapest, a neutral crossroads where the lines between state power and criminal enterprise were permanently blurred. He exploited the gaps in international law, moving through jurisdictions like a shadow passing through a picket fence. His methodology included the creation of virtual backdoors into the very systems designed to monitor illicit financial activities. While the agency searched for a monster, Mogilevich was busy building a corporation that would eventually become too big to fail. This was the brain of the operation, a centralized node that managed the chaos of 1,000 different criminal enterprises. The most dangerous part of his methodology was its invisibility. The heart of the empire was often hidden in plain sight. Time was his greatest ally. Every day the agency spent investigating was another day he used to move the capital. In the end, the methodology was a perfect loop, a cycle of deception that the world's finest hunters could never break. By the early 90s, Budapest became the epicenter where Eastern ambition met Western capital. Through a series of shadow exchanges, Mogilevich didn't just lead a gang. He engineered a corporate structure that treated violence as a necessary operational expenditure. He recruited not just thugs, but ex-KGB officers who understood the mechanics of state secrets and international subversion. The technical loophole involved jurisdictional arbitrage, where each criminal act occurred in a legal vacuum between 3 different nations. His network began supplying everything from Kalashnikov rifles to surface-to-air missiles, fueling conflicts across the African and Middle Eastern continents. The enforcers were military veterans who had operated in Kabul, men who felt no empathy when executing their calculated orders. The escalation reached its peak when he seized control of the natural gas pipelines that warmed the homes of Europe. By controlling the flow of energy, he gained a geopolitical chokehold that made him essential to the survival of nations. Intelligence reports suggested he wasn't just a criminal, but a strategic asset for the security services of the fallen empire. He became a billionaire ghost, a man who owned the very infrastructure that the world relied on for its daily survival. With a dozen different identities, he moved across borders like a phantom, collecting passports as if they were simple tourist souvenirs. No single tactical unit could track his movements, because he operated in the high-altitude silence of private jets and gated estates. In the desert heat, his associates brokered deals that traded Soviet military hardware for diamonds and untraceable digital currency. The most terrifying whispers involved the sale of nuclear materials, a threat that elevated his status from mobster to global menace. He dominated the heroin route stretching from Afghan poppy fields to the streets of London, a pipeline worth billions every year. His syndicate expanded into the dark corners of human trafficking, exploiting the vulnerable across the borders of a fractured Europe. Every transaction was hidden behind a Byzantine web of shell companies, making it impossible for forensic accountants to find the source. His wealth was stored in the deep vaults of offshore banks, protected by the very laws designed to ensure financial privacy. From the shores of Gibraltar to the banks of Cyprus, his money flowed like a river that never touched the shore. In the foggy streets of London, his influence began to seep into the boardrooms of the most respected financial institutions. When whistleblowers like Alexander Litvinenko spoke out, they were silenced by a reach that extended far beyond the borders of Russia. The use of rare toxins sent a chilling message to anyone who dared to expose the connection between crime and state. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was a protected pillar of a new system where power replaced the law. The Kremlin's umbrella provided a sanctuary where no international warrant could penetrate, regardless of the evidence the agency had gathered. On the deck of his luxury yacht, he watched the world's most powerful agencies struggle to grasp a shadow they couldn't touch. The global chessboard was now his to command, with every move calculated to ensure his total and absolute immunity from prosecution. As the sun set over his Moscow estate, the escalation was complete. The Ghost had become the master of the machine. In 2009, the Bureau decided to deploy its most powerful psychological weapon, placing a Ghost among the world's most dangerous men. The math of the list is simple. Since 1950, 94% of these fugitives have been captured through global public cooperation. The 2008 arrest at a Moscow cosmetics chain seemed like a breakthrough, but it was merely a carefully choreographed piece of theater. 18 months later, a court dismissed the charges as minor, releasing the world's most dangerous financier back into the city streets. The technical loophole was simple. Sovereign protection overrides international law, creating a jurisdictional vacuum that no agency can bridge. Even after the reward was raised to $5 million, the tips remained silent, stifled by the weight of Kremlin influence. Leaked intelligence tapes suggested a deep utility. Mogilevich wasn't just a criminal, he was a strategic asset for the state. By controlling the natural gas trade through Prosecutors, he became a gatekeeper for the energy that heated millions of European homes. The methodology involved jurisdictional arbitrage, hiding the ownership of energy assets behind a Byzantine web of neutral Swiss intermediaries. The message was clear. Those who spoke out, like Litvinenko, faced consequences that no Western intelligence agency could prevent. By December 2015, the agency finally admitted that their most prestigious list was being mocked by a man who refused to hide. He became only the 7th person in history to be removed from the list without being captured, killed, or surrendered. The 45-count indictment remains an active legal document, but in reality, it is nothing more than a historical artifact. For the victims who lost their life savings, the agency's surrender was a final bitter blow to the hope of restitution. The investigators who spent decades on the trail retired with the knowledge that some giants are simply too big to fall. Today, Mogilevich lives in comfort, a billionaire ghost who proved that political utility is the ultimate shield against any law. The math of power is brutal. When your value to a superpower exceeds the cost of your crimes, you become immune. The white whale remains in deep, protected waters, far beyond the reach of the hunters who once swore to catch him. His story is a reminder that the global financial system is only as strong as the political will to enforce its rules. He didn't just win the game, he changed the board until the opposition had no pieces left to move against him. The void left on the wall is a constant, silent testament to the one man the agency simply could not touch. Time has not eroded his influence. It has only solidified his position as a legend in the world of high-stakes crime. Moscow is no longer a hiding place. It is a fortress built on the foundations of mutual interest and shared secrets. The hunt is over, but the shadow he cast over the international financial system remains as dark as ever. We are left to wonder how many other ghosts are currently swimming in the same deep waters, protected by the same rules. In the end, the only rule that mattered was the one written in gold. Power is the ultimate form of immunity. The agency surrendered, but the world will never forget the name of the man who forced them to walk away. In the winter of 2015, the Bureau faced a reality that no amount of investigative pressure could ever hope to change. The technical loophole was not a flaw in the code, but a hard-coded boundary within the global system of sovereign extradition. The 45-count indictment remains a heavy physical weight, representing thousands of hours of work that led to a dead end. For the firefighters and teachers who lost their life savings, the agency's surrender is a bitter pill that offers no closure. The white whale has successfully navigated the most dangerous waters, leaving the hunters behind to gather the debris of their failure. Under the Kremlin's expansive umbrella, Mogilevich found a sanctuary where the reach of American law simply ceased to exist. By making himself essential to the energy flow of a superpower, he engineered a technical immunity that no court could pierce. The legal machinery of the West has ground to a halt, leaving the victims with nothing but 15 cents on the dollar. veterans of the chase retired with a heavy heart, knowing the most dangerous man they ever tracked is still free. The difference between El Chapo and Mogilevich is the difference between a state that broke and a state that never will. Today, Semion Mogilevich celebrates his longevity and comfort, a billionaire ghost who successfully outran the most powerful nation on Earth. His story is a reminder that the phrase "justice for all" often comes with an asterisk for those with enough power. The file is closed, but the shadow it cast over the global financial system will remain for decades to come. The collapse of YBM was not just a financial crime, it was a demonstration of how easily the market can be manipulated. He was the phantom conductor of a global orchestra, directing a symphony of fraud from a distance that no one could reach. Sovereign immunity became his ultimate technical shield, a barrier that the agency's most sophisticated legal tools could not penetrate. The empty chair at the table is a constant reminder of the one fugitive who successfully defied the system. His wealth was not just money, it was a network of influence that stretched across borders and into the halls of power. He moves through the city not as a fugitive, but as a respected citizen, protected by the very state he serves. The Byzantine web of shell companies was designed to fail upon inspection, leaving investigators with nothing but dead ends. The math of the underworld is simple. When you hold the key to the state's secrets, you are beyond arrest. For the victims, the passage of time has not healed the wounds, but only solidified the reality of their loss. The void left on the wall is a constant, silent testament to the limits of even the most powerful agency. The final judgment was not a conviction, but a quiet admission that the case had reached its inevitable end. Moscow is no longer a hiding place. It is a fortress where the rules of the West have no power. The hunt is over, but the shadow he cast over the global financial system will remain as a permanent legacy. We are left to wonder how many other ghosts are currently hiding in plain sight, protected by the same walls. In the end, the only rule that mattered was the one that stated power is its own form of justice. The agency surrendered, but the world will never forget the man who proved that some ghosts can never be caught. The white whale swims free in protected waters, a reminder that the reach of the law has a definitive, final edge.